because on that note, it's a good thing to remind everybody, like you can always double check. The good thing about the grade sheet, other than being able to see your grade anytime you want, is that you can double check my work. If I said, hey, good job, you got 4 points for that paper, and then you go look on the sheet and it says I gave you 3 points, then you can email back and say, hey, you said it was 4 points, but when I look at my sheet, it's 3 points. And then I can fix it. Or if you misunderstood, then I can tell you how you misunderstood. All right, let's see. We've got Ramsey, Reed, and Hamrick. Good morning. Yeah, I also see that Vance is online now. Cordone is online.
Good morning.
Davis, Ramsey, Reed, Hamrick, Vance, Cordone. All right. Everybody online is currently accounted for. We've got a little more than 2 minutes. Does anybody else have any questions? The last question, in case you missed it, and also I wasn't recording, was about independent work. So to remind you, it's like a semester-long thing and a weekly thing. Every week you're supposed to get about 7.2 points. And every week I share that independent worksheet with you. We're supposed to write your papers, and it tells you what you're supposed to hit. For example, last week you're supposed to hit 28.8 points. And next week it's what? I think 30 points, something like that. But, that's your goals. You have the weekly goals, and then you have the overall goal of 100. And it's a good time to remind you, once you hit that 100 mark, you're done for the semester. And one of you is fairly close. So once that person hits 100, they might hit it this weekend. And if they do, then they're done with independent work. They don't have to worry about it for the rest of the semester. So just thought I'd throw that out there. And also based on some stuff I've been reading recently, I want to remind you, do not plagiarize. And I don't know, maybe some professors are different than I am, but I also include plagiarism, or I also include rewording something as plagiarism. So if the sentence says, the president was concerned about the situation in Ukraine, and then you write it and say something about the things going on in Ukraine worried the president, right? That's the same thing, especially when you just have when I read what you wrote and I read what was on your source, and it's just like sentence for sentence, it's the same thing. You just happen to reword the sentences. That is plagiarism. So, be careful with that. Again, like I said before, I recommend read something as many times as you need it, then put it away and just write what you have to from memory. And that is an important skill way outside of biology or out of college. Like, you need to be able to, as a college-educated citizen, read something, comprehend it, and then be able to describe it to somebody else. Good morning. And what you could do on that note is, even if you feel bad not remembering details, like you read it a few times and then you write in your paper and you're like, some scientist said that there was some gene that helps reverse aging. And then you could literally write that and write whatever you can. And then if you need to, go back and fill in those little details. When you said some scientist, look it up and put the scientist's name. Some gene, look it up and put, the gene's name. That way you're writing it from your own memory. And that's such an important skill to have, especially for those of you who want to go to grad school. That's a lot of what the GRE is. Anyway, it's 8 o'clock. Let's get started. We have, let's see, in person, I know we've got White and Schmidt came in. And is it Flores? Yeah. All right. Schmidt here. Flores. All right. So I'm going to wait 1 second. Here we go. And for those of you online, we're just going to do what we usually do. Except this time, hopefully, I'll actually have questions for those who are missing it, because that doesn't pertain to you. If you're here online right now, we're going to do We're going to do keywords, and the first keyword is going to be paperclip, if you can see it. Paperclip is the first keyword for attendance today. Make sure you give me those emails before 9 a.m., anything after 9 a.m., and you're just going to have to do the questions. And that's just to ensure, because anybody can pop on this online, and I see that you're here. That doesn't mean you're actually here. You could be, I don't know, taking a nap right now, and I wouldn't know. So anyway, let me close this out. Close that out, and let's get started. I don't know if I can hear you. I think I could hear somebody online. So can someone online please confirm that you can hear me and see the screen?
I can.
Yes.
Thank you very much. All right, really quick with announcements. Lab, I'm sure you've seen the emails. Actually, I'm sure some of you haven't because you don't check your emails enough. But labs, if you were not there on Monday and you're supposed to be, you can make up for it. Watch the video I posted. Answer the questions. If you don't want to, like if you're a Wednesday person anyway and you don't want to come in today, watch the video. Answer the questions. You don't have to come in today. And again, if you read the announcement I posted, you can get extra credits for that, extra independent work points for that if you want. If you already did come in on Monday, I'm just trying to keep things fair. And also, I'll remind you again, the pre-lab that was due last Sunday, it is now basically just extended until next Sunday. So do your pre-labs if you haven't. This is the only one and only week where you can do that, and you can still get full credit. Same thing with mistakes. You can always fix your mistakes, but this is the 1 week where you can get full credit for doing it. And again, you don't have to do it alone. When you're sitting there working on it, send me an email. Say, hey, I'm working on my pre-lab. Do you mind meeting me online so you can walk me through this? I'm here to help. Really quick. Friday, my wife has an appointment in Ohio, so I will not physically be here. I will be online for office hours and lecture on Friday. I apologize in advance. I'm trying to work my way around it. Keep your eyes on your email, because if I can get that to change, which I'm trying really hard to do, then things will be normal. But for now, we're planning on not meeting here Friday. And again, I just want to remind everybody, if you meet me online to get feedback on your assignments, I will give you an automatic 5% boost on that assignment. The only deal is you have to sit through me talking to you about your assignment and giving you feedback, which I understand can be boring, but it is what it is. Any questions about announcements? Okay. In the last chapter, I kept saying, I mean, you should remember a lot of the things from the last chapter, but I kept saying the one thing you should remember from the last chapter is that cells need ATP for energy. Do you guys remember that? If anything else, if you forget everything else, remember that one thing. Cells need ATP for energy. This whole exam is that story. This whole exam is the story of chapter 5. Cells need ATP for energy. Chapter 6, what we're doing now. We make ATP from glucose. And then chapter 7 is we make glucose from the power of the sun. So basically, these 3 chapters bring all 3 things together. From chapter 1, when I said all ecosystems are solar powered and that you are solar powered and that there's this transformation of energy from one form to the next, these 3 chapters bring those things together. We go from the solar energy, right? We've got that light energy from the sun. That gets converted to glucose, which we're going to learn about in the next chapter. That glucose is then broken down to make ATP, which we're about to learn right now. And that ATP is what our cells need to make energy, to function. That's the energy they need to function. And that's what we learned in the last chapter. Anyway, really quick on the guessing game. Anybody know what this picture is? Not exactly, just generally. What is that thing? I think someone said it. Don't be shy. I'm sure you can guess and look. I'm sure someone's thinking it. What is it?
A brain?
Yes, it's a brain. It's a brain. And in your book, I forgot exactly the numbers they gave because it's not important anyway. But your book mentions that your brain burns calories, right? Your brain needs ATP. So even if you're just sitting there, if you're a veggie, like a vegetable, or you're a couch potato, and you're like not even physically moving, you're still burning calories because your brain burns calories. And again, your book talks about it and gives you a specific number. How about this picture here? This one's a little bit harder. I don't know. If you couldn't guess brain, you might not be able to guess this. But specifically, what's that stuff? Any guesses? That's okay. We don't have time to guess. It's soy sauce. And there's a certain way you can make soy sauce. It's called fermentation. And in this chapter, you're going to learn about what fermentation is. Of course, you can also use fermentation to make beer, wine, liquor, and a bunch of other things. But you're going to learn about that in this chapter. What about this? Bottom left, what is this a picture of? It's a car, yeah. And I like that they're showing, I assume that's the intake, or maybe it's just for looks, but let's assume that's the intake. Cars need oxygen, right? Because what happens is cars burn the carbon molecule called octane in the presence of oxygen. And when that happens, that's a chemical reaction. That releases heat. That heat is then used to move pistons, which turns a bunch of stuff, and that's what makes the car go. And your bodies, your cells do the same similar thing. They break down molecules in the presence of oxygen, and it releases energy that's being put to use. And of course, some of that energy is lost as heat, just like it is for cars. And of course, the car has a byproduct when you do that. When you burn gasoline, two of the byproducts are water and carbon dioxide, right? And it's the same thing for you. When you burn stuff, burn it in the presence of oxygen, you release byproducts, carbon dioxide and water. Any questions about this guessing game thing? All right. Every chapter starts with this, biology and society. I skip it. I'm never going to test you on anything that's on here. I am going to go through it slowly, though, because I think there was a word that you needed to know that will come back later. Aerobic capacity. I think we might talk about that later. So really quickly, I'll just go ahead and tell you what that is. That is the maximum rate that oxygen can be taken in and used by your cells. So when you work out and do cardio, that's one of those things that you're improving. Your aerobic capacity is not set in stone. As you work out, that's something you get better at. Your cells get better at taking in more oxygen. Your aerobic capacity, another way of putting it is the most strenuous exercise that the body can maintain aerobically. Meaning, again, like if you were sprinting, you can go only so far and so fast at full speed, and eventually you run out of energy and you have to start slowing down. But that's not a really important concept for the semester or the chapter. But that word aerobic is slightly important, and we're going to come back to that word. So that's the only reason I wanted to even pause and tell you what aerobic capacity was. And then again, this word too, and again, we're going to talk about this word later, but for now, a little preview. If aerobic means with oxygen, anaerobic just means without oxygen. And what your book was trying to get at, even though I usually skip this biology and society, if you're into working out or if you've ever done it, it kind of talks about, like, again, when you're sprinting, you can only go so far before you start running out of energy and before you start burning, like your muscles start burning. And this is all related to oxygen and how oxygen is used to make ATP. And we'll talk about that throughout the semester, or throughout this chapter. You'll notice I'm going to have to go a little bit quick on chapter 6 because I'm trying to catch up. Knox, when you get a chance, or to remind you, email me when you get a chance and let me know that you came late. All right. Here we go. This chapter is broken down into 3 big bullet points. Energy flow and chemical cycling. So this first bullet point is kind of like a big overview of the next 2 chapters. And then this middle bullet point is when we really get into the meat and potatoes of this chapter. It's when we really start learning about cellular respiration. And then the last point is going to be fermentation, which for the purposes of this conversation, I could say it's a different version of cellular respiration, and you'll see what I mean. So here we go. Let's jump into it. Let's talk about the preview, basically, of the next 2 chapters. As you already know from chapter 1, and this is why this is so important, this is why we're learning about it, because without life, you wouldn't have this. All life requires energy, right? Nothing lives without energy. Like we already said in chapter 1, as far as we're concerned in this class, all that energy originates with the sun. Yes, there are a few exceptions. You can look those up for independent work if you want. But as far as we're concerned, for conversations and for exams, all energy for life on Earth originated with the sun. And again, like I said in chapter 1, when you need energy, you can't go out naked and absorb sunlight, right? That's not going to give you energy. No, it's got to be converted from one form to another. And that's where photosynthesis comes in. And if you want, you can give your hand a break. There's no need to write that down because we're going to have a whole chapter on it, next chapter. But your book wants to give you the big overview before we start diving into the specifics of cellular respiration. So as you probably already know, photosynthesis converts sunlight energy to the chemical energy of sugars and other molecules. And really, as far as we're concerned, and again, you don't need to write this down because we'll talk about it later. Photosynthesis, the one thing that we're going to talk about, just to keep it simple, photosynthesis makes glucose. Photosynthesis converts all that sunlight energy, and it uses that energy to build a molecule, and that molecule is glucose. And again, we'll talk about that later. just keep in the back of your mind when we do talk about that later, and I keep saying glucose, 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 keep in mind in all actuality that also makes other molecules as well. But this is a Bio 101 class, so we're trying to keep it simple. So anyway, yes, the energy originates with the sun. And then plants take that energy and convert it to a molecule that can be eaten. And then animals eat it, right? So that's how the energy gets from the sun to us, right? We eat the plants. Or sometimes we eat animals that have eaten the plants, so on and so forth. Or fungi that have decomposed the plants or the animals. I go on and on, but we don't have time for that. Any questions about this slide? Pretty simple stuff, right? You probably learned about this in middle school and high school. All right.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Is the online, are you on a different slide? Because mine is still on announcements, and I don't know if it's me or, but I can hear you perfectly.
I'm glad you said it. I can fix that.
Okay.
Knock on wood. I hope I can fix that. Hold on one second.
If not, I'll just go out and rejoin and try again.
Thank you.
Okay, now it's on the producers and consumers.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. All right. So anyway, I'm so glad you said that. Now we're talking about producers and consumers. Before I get into this, let me also tell you this. We're going to talk about producers and consumers later in the semester, not even this exam, right? Not even chapters 5, 6, and 7. We're going to talk about it later. So for now, just take all this information in. Take notes if you want, but you don't really need to, because I'm not going to test you on this stuff yet. I think this information is on the study guide. But again, this will come later in the semester. So for now, it won't be on this next exam, exam 2. There are things called autotrophs. Those are the things that do photosynthesis. Plants and some other things. For independent work, you can look up what are those other things. Everybody knows about plants. Excuse me. But what are the other things that also do photosynthesis? But again, later in the semester, you're going to need to know that that's what an autotroph is. An autotroph is something that makes its own food. And for your own knowledge, we keep it simple in this course, and we just call autotrophs the things that do photosynthesis. But there are a few exceptions of things that make energy other ways without photosynthesis. And again, that goes back to that thing I said earlier, where as far as we're concerned, all the energy comes from the sun, but there are a few exceptions. So those few exceptions to that also are the few exceptions to this. Anyway, autotrophs, they make their own organic matter. So all those things you learned about in chapter 3, the carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, autotrophs make those themselves. They use the energy from the sun. They get some raw materials from the environment. They put it all together. Also, when I say the raw materials from the environment, let me get a little bit more specific. Carbon dioxide from the air, water from wherever it gets it, and minerals from the soil. And of course, what we're concerned about in this chapter, or this exam, is going to be these 2 bullet points right here. Whoops. The carbon dioxide and the water. And you'll notice as we go through this, that's really all we talk about. Later in the semester, we'll talk about some of the other minerals from the soil. Because as we know from carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, we know that we need things like phosphate, and that's not accounted for in carbon dioxide and water. We know we need nitrogen, right? Nitrogen's one of the big 4. That's not accounted for in carbon dioxide and water, but that's a conversation we'll have later. So anyway, those are autotrophs. Does anybody have questions about autotrophs? All right. Then there's us, heterotrophs. Those are things that basically eat other heterotrophs and eat autotrophs. Because we cannot make our own organic matter from inorganic matter. Now, some things we can, and if you've watched that Crash Course Biology, that really short, great video that does a better job of explaining things than I do, they talk about not nucleic acids, the amino acids, and how the human body, our cells, can make some of those 20 amino acids that we need, but there's some that we cannot make, and those are called essential amino acids. Those are the ones that we need in our diet because we can't make them. And again, that goes back to this idea of heterotrophs. There's a lot of things that we can't eat for ourselves, so we have to eat other stuff. All right. Are there any questions about heterotrophs, or for that matter, heterotrophs and autotrophs? All right, before I go to the next slide, I'll remind you, this stuff will be back later in the semester. So for now, for this next exam, for exam 2, which covers chapters 5, 6, and 7, this stuff will not be on it. It is on the study guide, but it will not be on the exam. Or if it does, it'll be extra credit. Again, like I've said earlier, most ecosystems depend entirely on photosynthesis for food, which is another way of saying what I've already said today and in chapter 1. Most ecosystems depend entirely on the energy from the sun, right? That's the same, it's kind of saying the same thing in a different way. And here's some more words that you do not need to know for this next exam, but you will need to know later in the semester: producers and consumers. As far as we're concerned in this conversation, producers are essentially the same thing as autotrophs. Those are things that are producing what the ecosystem needs by converting that solar energy into chemical energy. Heterotrophs are the consumers. Those are the things not producing anything. They're just consuming everything that the producers are making. It's that simple. It'll be back later in the semester. Oh, good independent work idea if you guys think koalas are cute or whatever. First of all, they're either endangered or close to being endangered now. So that's something you could write about because of the big wildfires in Australia. Another thing, koalas are really, really stupid. They're one of the dumbest mammals on Earth. And you can read about that and write about it if you want. And another thing about koalas, they are dying of, other than their problems with the wildfire, sexually transmitted diseases. Chlamydia is rampant in koalas. That has nothing to do with this semester or this chapter. Just giving you guys some ideas for independent work, and that picture reminded me of it. Anyway, any questions about producers and consumers, which will not be on this exam, but we're going to come back to later in the semester? All right. Now we get into some slightly more relevant information as far as this chapter is concerned. We're going to talk about chemical cycling between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Because again, this next bullet point is the big picture. The next exam covers chapters 5, 6, and 7, which is basically saying cells need ATP to make energy. They make ATP by burning glucose, and they make glucose from photosynthesis, right? Those are the 3 statements you can make for each chapter. This covers this entire exam. So let's talk about it very quickly. A big overview before we get into the details. You do not need to write this down because next chapter we're going to talk about photosynthesis. So for now, I'm just giving you the overview. The ingredients for photosynthesis, as you should already know from lab, for those of you who've had it or read the introduction, the ingredients are carbon dioxide and water, right? Those are the 2 ingredients that we need for photosynthesis. You could get technical and say we need other things, but I won't get into that. That is the chemical formula, right? We need carbon dioxide and we need water. Where does that come from? The carbon dioxide comes from the air. Well, if it's not an aquatic plant. And the water comes from the soil, generally speaking. Now, this is all from your book. Obviously, there's exceptions to this. There are some plants that get water from elsewhere. And obviously, any plant that's underwater, it's not getting its gas from the air. It's not getting its carbon dioxide from the air. It's getting it from the water. So as far as I'm concerned, you could even just ignore these 2 bullet points, but they did come from your textbook, which is why I included them. And again, the thing you need to know from this slide, which we're going to cover next chapter, is that the ingredients for photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. And you probably already knew that. Any questions about that? Okay. There's these things called chloroplasts. And those are the things that use the light energy to rearrange the atoms of those ingredients that I just talked about, the carbon dioxide and the water, to produce something called sugar or something called glucose. So again, if you're taking notes, I would give your hand a break. This is just a preview because we're going to have a whole chapter devoted to this. Right now, we're kind of giving you the background information so you understand what we're talking about once we actually do get into respiration. So yes, again, like I said in chapter 2 when we're talking about chemistry, and like I said in chapter 3 when we're talking about biological molecules, and like I said in chapter 5 when we're talking about enzymes, it takes energy to build molecules. And the more energy it takes to build a molecule, as far as we're concerned in this class, that's how much energy is ready to be released. And I keep using this analogy, and I'm coming back to it. However much energy is used in that crossbow to pull that thing back, that's how much energy is going to be released when you pull the trigger, right? It's the same thing here. Building a molecule, however much energy it takes to build it, that's how much energy will be released when you break those bonds. And again, As far as we're concerned, what we focus on in this course is that plants, they make something called glucose. So again, as far as we're concerned, photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide and water, and it uses the energy of the sun to rearrange those things to make glucose. And yes, in the back of your mind, keep in the back of your mind that yes, it doesn't do more than make glucose. It makes other organic molecules as well, but we won't talk about them. One very important thing in the context of this chapter as well is this third bullet point. A byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen gas. That is where our oxygen comes from. There was a time on Earth where there was basically no oxygen in the atmosphere. And then life evolved. The first life, when we eventually started having photosynthetic organisms and we had more oxygen, and that really changed things. And you can look that up for independent work if you want as well. But are there any questions about this slide? So again, photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide and water, produces glucose and oxygen. I just gave you there the chemical formula. Obviously, animals and plants use the products of photosynthesis as sources of energy. Because again, especially with animals, that is it, right? That's where we get our energy. We have to eat our energy. Unlike plants, we cannot convert solar energy to other forms of energy. You have to eat our energy. You probably already knew that, but I do want to focus on this little part right here. This will probably be one test question. People will screw it up because it's easy to get this confused. Plants also use the products, right? So yes, plants are the things doing the photosynthesis and making the glucose, but they still do the same thing we do. To get energy that their cells need, they need to go through respiration, which is what we're about to cover. Respiration is that thing that breaks down glucose to make ATP. So even though plants do convert solar energy to glucose, that's still step one. And then we have step two in common. Step two being we need to break down that glucose to produce ATP. So that's just something interesting and something to keep in the back of your mind, right? Plants also have to do respiration. They have to. Because all that photosynthesis they're doing, it's not making ATP. Well, that's a whole different story. We'll talk about that later. But it's not giving them exactly what their cells need for energy, right? For the most part, it's just making them glucose. And then they have to go through the same process we do. They've got to break it down. And what is that process called? It's called cellular respiration, and that's what this chapter is about. Cellular respiration is the chemical process that harvests the energy that's stored in sugars, little star on that word, because I also say in other molecules too. But as far as we're concerned, it's breaking down glucose. You definitely do not need to know the definition of cellular respiration. Now's a good time to let you know how this exam is going to go for this portion. What I'm going to do, when you're about to learn this, cellular respiration is broken down into 3 stages. And that's the way the exam is going to go. I'm going to say, in which stage does this happen? And those will be your choices. One of those 3 stages. In which stage does that happen? In which stage is this ingredient used? In which stage is this product produced? So keep that in your mind as we're going through this, because that's how the exam is going to go. I'm not going to say list the 3 stages of photosynthesis. I'm going to say, whoops, in which of the 3 stages is oxygen used? In which of the 3 stages is water produced? Things like that. Anyway, any questions about this slide? The Walking Dead reference. Again, we're just going back to the idea of the crossbow, right? That's, as far as we're concerned, that's a molecule of glucose. All that energy ready to be released when you break the bonds. All right. You don't necessarily need to write this down. But yes, respiration uses oxygen. That is a very important thing. So when I say you don't necessarily need to write it down, it's not because it's not important. It is very important. The reason I say you don't necessarily need to write it down is because we're going to talk about that throughout the whole process. So if you can't remember that respiration uses oxygen after we're done talking about it, then you're just out of luck anyway. Like, I don't know. Anyway, yes, respiration uses oxygen. And that's an easy thing to remember. Keep in mind, we're talking about cellular respiration, right? We're talking about cellular respiration, but it's very similar to what you guys probably think about respiration. If you weren't sitting in biology and I said respiration, what would you think I was talking about? Any guesses? Breathing, right? Breathing, right? Breathing in stuff, breathing out stuff. Specifically, breathing in for the purposes of getting oxygen, breathing out for the purposes of getting rid of carbon dioxide, right? So if you can remember that you're breathing in for the purposes of getting oxygen, then you can remember cellular respiration uses oxygen. Anyway, cellular respiration also converts the energy in those chemical bonds of those organic fuels, specifically glucose is the one that we're going to focus on, to source and other sources to make ATP. So again, big picture stuff before we start getting into details. We break down these molecules in the presence of oxygen. That energy that we release when we break down the molecules, that's what we use to make ATP. Here's something you should write down. Maybe not even that yet. I don't know, because we're going to talk about this later too. But the production of the ATP, most of it anyway, it occurs in an organelle called the mitochondria. That will be a test question. People will get it wrong, and I will cry because I will think, you must have never read the book once. You must have never listened to what I said, and you must have never paid attention in high school either. Chloroplast is where photosynthesis happens. Mitochondria is where cellular respiration happens. I'm going to pause and let you guys marinate on that for a second because, again, that's one of the easiest questions that's going to be on the exam, and some of you will miss it. Mitochondria is where respiration happens. Chloroplast, what sounds a lot like chlorophyll, is where photosynthesis happens. That will be a test question. Side note, and I already said this earlier, but I also want to mention this. Not all ATP is made in the mitochondria. There are some exceptions, and we'll talk about those exceptions, some of the exceptions. And when we're done talking about some of those exceptions, you could look into the other exceptions. Also a good time to point out, a mitochondria, as it says right here, is an organelle. And I know we didn't talk much about this because it's in chapter 4, and we skipped chapter 4, but there's two basic types of cells on Earth. There's prokaryotes and there's eukaryotes, basically. We are the more complicated eukaryotes, meaning we have organelles like mitochondria and nuclei, things like that. Then there's prokaryotes like bacteria that don't have these things. So that's a good test question. Not a good test question. That's a good independent work topic if you want to look into it. How in the world do bacteria and other prokaryotes that don't have organelles, therefore don't have mitochondria, how do they make ATP? I wouldn't look it up yet because first it might help to know how mitochondria make ATP. Then you could look up how other cells do it. Any questions about this slide? Respiration uses oxygen to make ATP by breaking down glucose and other molecules. And it happens in the mitochondria. All right, nice and easy. Already saw that one. Let's go in the correct direction. Here we go. The waste products of respiration are carbon dioxide and water. There's an easy way to remember that. Does anybody want to venture a guess to what you breathe out when you breathe out? Like what's coming out when you breathe out? Say, forget cellular
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide, right? Thank you. Carbon dioxide comes out. That's easy to remember. I hope. I hope you know that when you breathe out, that's what's coming out, right? You're taking the carbon dioxide out of your blood, and then you're getting rid of it. And I don't know if you guys can see this, but watch this. Let's see. What else came out? You guys maybe have seen it. Look, what's that? Like, what else came out? That's not carbon dioxide you're looking at right there. What is that? I mean, there's probably hydrogen in there. Simpler than that. Water. So if you ever breathed on a mirror on a glass and you've seen it fog up, that's water. Or if you've ever breathed outside when it's cold and it fogs up, that's water. The only reason I'm even going through this is someone's going to miss that test question too, even though it's one of the easiest things to remember. The waste products of cellular respiration are also the same waste products of respiration as we think of it, carbon dioxide and water. And again, your book points this out, big picture stuff. The waste products of respiration are also the same ingredients used for photosynthesis. And if I had like a little clicky thing, I would like play the circle of life from Lion King right now. It's a circle of life, right? Photosynthesis produces oxygen and glucose. We use it. And in the process of using it, we produce carbon dioxide and water. And then the circle continues, right? Then photosynthesis uses that, blah, 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 and the circle continues. And this at the bottom is the actual formula for respiration. And you need you sort of need to know this. Yeah, you need to know this. You don't need to know the numbers. What you don't need to know is the ratio. You don't need to know that for every one molecule of glucose, we need 6 molecules of oxygen, and we produce 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water and 38 ATP. I'll come back to that. But for now, you can just ignore all those numbers. The point is, in respiration, and this is the part you do need to know, we break down glucose in the presence of oxygen to make carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. You need to know that. And again, keep in mind, the way the exam is going to go, there's going to be a test question that says, which of the 3 stages uses glucose? Which of the 3 stages uses oxygen? Which of the 3 stages produces carbon dioxide? Which of the 3 stages produces water? Which of the 3 stages produces ATP? So that's why you need to know the formula, because that's how it's going to go, right? Not only do you need to know what the ingredients and the products are, you need to know in which stage they are used or produced, depending on what they are. Excuse me. Don't worry, guys. It's not COVID. I've been tested. Anyway, are there any questions about this? Okay, here's a picture of what I'm talking about the circle of life. Again, plants are using carbon dioxide and water to produce glucose. And as a byproduct of that, they produce oxygen. Animals use that glucose and break it down in the presence of oxygen. And in the process, they produce carbon dioxide and water, and the circle continues. The circle of life. Here we go. I'm going to put a big 7 right here for chapter 7 is when we talk about photosynthesis. Chapter 6, which is what we're on right now, is all about cellular respiration. I don't know. Maybe I'll put 5 right here. Chapter 5 says cells need ATP for energy, right? So there we go. All 3 chapters are going to be on this exam in that picture. Any questions about this? Okay. You don't necessarily need to write this down. This is sort of like a side note, something to think about. Plants make more than they need for fuel. So again, plants can't directly use the energy from photosynthesis, right? They don't just use that and then their cells like, all right, we've got some energy. No, their cells still need ATP and they still have to go through cellular respiration to make that ATP. However, your book points out the fact that the plant is going through so much photosynthesis, it's making more than it needs to make the ATP. It has a surplus. What does it do with that surplus? Well, let's go back to chapter 3. This is why chapter 3 was so important. It makes polysaccharides, specifically cellulose, which you already know. That's the thing that's in the cell walls. When you look at a plant, that's mostly what you're looking at. And of course, starch. Because remember, energy is stored in the form of starch for plants, unlike animals, which use glycogen. And of course, people take advantage of this by eating plants, right? So we eat the plants, we eat their surplus. That's how we get the energy. That's how we get these organic materials that we need. Any questions about this slide? All right. You guys are pretty easy today. Now the good stuff. This is probably the most important of the bullet points. As far as you're concerned, like if you're just worried about your grade, this bullet point right here is the most important. Because here we're actually going to talk about cellular respiration, which is mostly what this chapter is going to cover, or what the exam is going to cover regarding this chapter. Again, this is a repeat. I'm just repeating myself here. So if you're a note taker, give your hand a break. Cellular respiration is the harvesting of chemical energy from organic molecules. And again, specifically, as far as we're concerned, that organic molecule is glucose. There are exceptions. We'll talk about some of them, not all of them. Cellular respiration is the main way that chemical energy is harvested from food and converted to ATP. That's a big one. My recommendation for studying this chapter is to start with the big picture and then start adding details. So the big picture, the one sentence you should memorize first when studying this chapter. Cellular respiration makes ATP. Once you have that memorized, then add in some details. Cellular respiration breaks down other molecules to make ATP. And then we're going to get into some more detail coming up. Oh, yeah, here we go. The next bullet point. As I've already said, it's an aerobic process, meaning it requires oxygen. Aerobic is going to be a word that might be on the exam. Aerobic, meaning with oxygen, as opposed to anaerobic, which means without oxygen. So again, if you're studying big picture, cellular respiration makes ATP. And then add the fact. Cellular respiration breaks down other molecules to make ATP. Okay, and then once you have that memorized, cellular respiration breaks down other molecules in the presence of oxygen to make ATP. And then you could even add another portion to that sentence. Once you have that other sentence memorized, cellular respiration makes ATP by breaking down other molecules in the presence of oxygen, and then add, and then byproduct is carbon dioxide. So again, that's my advice for studying this chapter. Start with the big, simple stuff, even putting it in sentence form. Memorize that one simple sentence, and then add one bit of detail to it. Memorize it. Add another detail to it. Memorize it. Anyway, any questions about what's on this slide? All right. Here's a picture of what we're talking about. I like this because it's sort of like it brings together what we think of as respiration probably, which is breathing, and then cellular respiration. So what's happening here is respiration, right? We got oxygen coming in into her lungs, which then gets to her blood, which then goes to her muscles. And that's where cellular respiration happens, which is what this chapter is going to be about. Cellular respiration uses that oxygen and gets rid of carbon dioxide. And then we get back to the regular respiration, right? That carbon dioxide goes into the blood, which then goes into the lungs, which then goes out her mouth or nose, depending on how she's breathing. Anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. My first semester teaching, one of the students said, "We're not biology majors. Why do we need to know this much detail?" And I kind of laughed a little bit to myself. And I said, "Believe me, what I'm teaching you is not much detail. And that's the only reason I even include this. This is what I learned, I think as a senior, I don't know. As an undergrad, this is what I learned for one step of photosynthesis. So don't write this down. The only point here is, as I'm going through photosynthesis and you're thinking to yourself, oh my God, this is so complicated. I'm not even a biology major. Why is it so complicated? Keep in mind that you are getting the easy version, all right? So please, I'm not giving you the hard version. As a matter of fact, the stuff I teach you, you'll see, there'll be stuff that's in the book that I will tell you, you know what, don't even worry about that for the exam. So I'm even making it a lighter load than what the book is giving you. I'll give you the information from the book, but then I'll tell you that detail won't be on the exam. Anyway, we can jump into it. This first bullet point is an overview of cellular respiration. So if you're taking notes, you don't necessarily have to. I don't know. Everybody takes notes differently. But basically what we're going to do is cover the whole process in this bullet point. Really like scratching the surface, cliff notes, no details. And then after I give you the overview and tell you all basically how it happens, then we'll come back and go into detail about how it really, really happens. Again, this is from your book. This is why I'm being so repetitive, because I teach out of the book. Life depends on the transformation of energy and matter, right? You learned that in chapter 1. Again, this is why you're learning about it. This isn't trivial. Without this boring stuff that you're learning, we would not be alive. Few of these transformations of energy are as important as what we're talking about, basically. And again, what we're talking about is breaking down food molecules, specifically glucose is the one we're going to focus on. We're breaking it down to produce ATP. Because again, that's cellular respiration. Breaking down, the point of cellular respiration is to make ATP. Any questions about this slide? So far, this is all repetitive. We've already said all this. Again, there's the formula. Glucose broken down in the presence of water. I like how your book just says many steps, and we're going to talk about those many steps soon. Gives us carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. And again, your book says this, and it might even be in the study guide, but I don't care about the ratio. You don't need to know that it's 6 molecules of oxygen per 1 molecule of glucose. The only number you need to know on this slide is this number right here. How many oxygen are produced in ATP? Excuse me. How many ATP are produced in cellular respiration? About 32. And you'll notice that other slide I showed you, if you remember, it said 38. Because if you look it up, if you Google it, it differs depending on who you're talking to. But since I teach out of the book, the number you need to know is 32. And I'm not going to make it tricky. In this multiple choice exam, your choices are not going to be 31, 32, 33, or 34. It'd be more like, is it 32 or 25 or 48 or 55, right? It's going to be something big. Just get in the ballpark. Remember 32. Again, this is an overview. There's no need to write any of this down. But we will point out that cellular respiration consists of over 24 chemical reactions. And there is one specific enzyme for each one of those reactions. And that's just something you should keep in the back of your mind, especially for lab when we're talking about the temperature thing. And we know that enzymes are affected by temperature. So you should think if there's over 24 reactions and each one of them has an enzyme that does that job, you could probably guess that temperature will have an effect. What kind of effect? I don't know. Because again, like I said in lab on Monday, if you were there, some plants do really good in cold weather and die in warm weather and vice versa. So their enzymes are evolved to be in that certain situation. And you guys are dealing with algae beads. You don't know what they're evolved for, so we'll see. Anyway, one of the most important metabolic pathways, cellular respiration is one of the most important metabolic pathways for nearly every single eukaryotic cell. Again, this is the thing that gives us ATP. And if there's one thing you should remember from chapter 5, cells need ATP for energy. So that's chapter 5, right? Chapter 6, if there's one thing you should remember, this is how we make ATP. Cellular respiration is how we make ATP. Excuse me. And again, I put a little star here to remind you that this is talking about eukaryotic cells, the complicated one. This does not include things like bacteria, things like that. Any questions about what's on the slide? I'm not going to ask you how many chemical reactions. This is all basically stuff you should just keep in the back of your mind as we discuss cellular respiration. All right. You can write this down if you want, but you don't necessarily have to because we're going to talk about each of these three separately. But cellular respiration is broken down into three main stages: glycolysis, citric acid, and electron transport chain. And this is the chunk of your exam. Most of it's going to be that. And which of these three stages is ATP produced? In which of these three stages is oxygen used? In which of these three stages is glucose used? In which of these three stages is carbon dioxide used? In which of these three stages, occurs in the mitochondria or out of the mitochondria, however I might word it? These are all questions that you're going to get. And this is going to be, again, it's a multiple choice exam, so these are going to be your options. Well, sort of. It'll be like glycolysis, citric acid cycle, electron transport chain, or A and C, or B and C, or A and B, or all three. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this little animation of cellular respiration in action. You can if you want. Instead, I recommend watching those videos that I've already posted to the lab, those biology crash courses where the guy talks for 12 minutes about it. He does a great job, great animations. You should watch that instead of this, or if you're really studious, watch them both. All right, again, three stages. The first stage is called glycolysis. There's no need to write this down because we will talk about it later. But what does glycolysis do? It splits glucose, one molecule of glucose, into two molecules of pyruvate. This usually happens inside of the cytoplasm, which is another way of saying outside of the mitochondria. So there's a lot of test questions right here. Which of the three stages uses glucose? Glycolysis. Which of the three stages produces pyruvate? Glycolysis. Which of the three stages happens outside of the mitochondria? Glycolysis. Which of the three stages happens inside of the cytoplasm, which is the same thing of asking outside of the mitochondria? Glycolysis. So again, we're going to come back to this. This is still the overview. You're going to get this information again. But there's a lot of test questions in that one little sentence. Are there any questions yet about glycolysis? And you know what? Yeah. It should make sense since the glycolysis is the first step, that it would be the thing that breaks down glucose, right? Because glucose is the ingredient, right? Also, it sounds the same. And people will miss this test question, and again, it makes me want to cry because it's pretty easy. Glycolysis and glucose, they sound pretty similar, right? Which one breaks down glucose? Glycolysis. Citric acid cycle, that's the next one. And I'm going quick again because we're going to come back. This is just the overview. We're going to talk about this in detail. Citric acid cycle is the next stage. This happens inside the mitochondria, unlike the last one we talked about, which happened outside of the mitochondria. And this completes the whole breakdown. Because remember, we started with glucose, we broke it in half into two things, the pyruvate, and then we keep breaking those things down all the way down to carbon dioxide. But again, we'll come back to that and talk about it in more detail. But for now, I'll give you some test questions. Which of the three stages happens inside the mitochondria? Citric acid cycle. Well, and the next one that we're going to talk about. Which of the three stages produces carbon dioxide? Citric acid cycle. And I put a star next to citric acid cycle because there's another word for it. And I don't even remember what your book uses. But the other word for citric acid cycle is the Krebs cycle. K-R-E-B. But I don't use that because I want things to be easier for you. So if you notice, citric acid cycle produces carbon dioxide. All those C's. Please don't miss that on the exam. It's easy. It's there. Which of the three stages produces carbon dioxide? Citric acid cycle. All these C's. C, 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 C. And here's a spoiler alert. When we talk about photosynthesis, which uses carbon dioxide, which of those stages uses carbon dioxide? Well, the stage in photosynthesis that uses carbon dioxide also has a C in it. So for this exam, when you think about carbon dioxide, first of all, always think of a cycle and always think of the letter C. That will be the right answer. If it's carbon dioxide, it's either used or produced in a cycle. It's going to have C's in it. Any questions about this slide? All right, glycolysis and citric acid generate a small amount of ATP directly. You can look up how much if you want. Might be a good independent work question if you want like half a point, because there'll probably be 2 sentences to answer it. But much more ATP is indirectly made by transferring electrons from fuel molecules to something called NAD+. We're going to talk about that later. Basically, with this point, the point of this slide is this. The first 2 stages that we just talked about, glycolysis and citric acid cycle, they do make a little bit of ATP. And remember, if there's anything you should remember from chapter 6, it's that cellular respiration produces ATP, right? So that's the big picture. So we point out that the first 2 stages, they make a little bit of ATP. But the big money maker is the next one. It's called the electron transport chain. We're about to talk about it. But for now, I'm not even going to talk about this NAD+ and NADH. I'm going to talk about all that later when we get to it. For now, what I want you to know, because again, we're just talking about the big picture. The first 2 stages, they produce a little bit of ATP. But really what the first 2 stages do is they are there to support the 3rd stage, because the 3rd stage is the moneymaker. That's the thing making the most ATP. And the first 2 stages are just there to help. And yes, this slide tells you how they help, but we'll come back to that. For now, just know that the first 2 stages produce a little bit of ATP, but mostly they're just there to help the 3rd stage, which is the electron transport chain. This is where we've already harvested some electrons, which I'll talk about later. Those electrons have a lot of energy, which I'll talk about later. And this electron transport chain, which is really just a chain of proteins, it strips away that energy. And when that happens, those electrons have to go somewhere. And I'm going to talk about this later. It goes to oxygen. That's the thing that makes water. I'm just saying that quickly because I'm going to talk about it later. Yeah, and again, I'm not going to cover this slide in much detail because we'll talk about it later. But really quickly, some test questions from this one slide. What is the 3rd stage of respiration? Electron transport chain. Which of the 3 stages strips electrons from their energy? Electron transport chain. Which of the 3 stages uses oxygen? Electron transport chain. Which of the 3 stages produces water? Electron transport chain. Yeah, and this other stuff we'll talk about later when we actually talk about it in detail. And again, there's the overall equation again from the slide. I really am, you can all study the way you want, but my biggest suggestion is look at the big picture and then start adding in details. Carbon dioxide makes ATP. Okay, once you have that memorized. Carbon dioxide breaks down glucose to make ATP. Okay, once you have that memorized. Carbon dioxide breaks down glucose in the presence of oxygen to make ATP. Once you have that memorized, carbon dioxide breaks down glucose in the presence of oxygen to make ATP, and then the process makes carbon dioxide and water. You see what I'm getting at? Start easy and just start adding details. Memorize the simplest thing, and once you have that memorized, start Just add one more detail and memorize that. Any questions about that slide? Again, this picture's not from your book because it says 38 ATP. And again, the number you need to know is 32. And there's a picture of everything that happens, right? There's all the test questions I've just said are right there. Glycolysis happens outside of the mitochondria. The other two happen inside of the mitochondria. And that's where we'll end on Friday, which we will not meet in person on Friday. That'll be online. We'll start here. If you came in late, don't forget to email me. Just tell me you came in late so you can get some attendance points. Or you could wait until the video comes out, answer the questions, and get full credit for attendance. It's up to you. If you email me and say you were late, you'll get half credit. If you do the questions, you'll get full credit. Any questions about anything? Oh, man, attendance. It's going to be another one of those days. The other word, the second word for attendance again, is going to be
donuts.
Road trip. Yeah, don't make me hungry. Road trip is the second because I've got to do this damn road trip on Friday, which is why I can't be here in person.
Wait, so there's only...
Can we like watch the video, do the questions for independent work?
Somebody was talking over you when you said the keyword, so I didn't hear you.
That's okay. I'm glad you asked. It is road trip. You know, driving around, going somewhere, road trip. And yes, that's a great question, Vance. Even though you guys have gotten your attendance points, you can still watch the videos and answer the questions for independent work points. Yeah.
All right, thank you.